Hey everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Chat. My name is Robbie Spengler, and we are trying to bring Catholicism back into the conversation. Today we wanted to talk about the Deuterocanonical books. So in the Catholic Bible, there are 7 additional books that you would find that are not in the Protestant Bible. Or rather, I guess it'd be better to say it as in the Protestant Bible there are 7 books missing that the Catholic Bible has. So the Deuterocanonical books that are in the Old Testament are the Book of Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, and then 1st and 2nd Maccabees are the 7 books. And then there also were additions to the Book of Daniel and Esther. And so those are the books that the Catholics kept in the Bible and the Protestants removed. The first myth to get out of the way, just right off the bat, is the idea that we added these books in later. That is not true. If you were to go back and look into the history of how the books came to be, they were around from the very beginning. In fact, it was with the Jewish community, actually. So in about 90 A.D., you had this Christian uprising, which the Jews were perceiving as this like cult. And so there were different canons of Old Testament books that were out there. And so some of the Jews got together at what is called Jevna, I think, Javneh, in 90 AD to determine which books would be in their canon. But you have to keep in mind, when they're doing this, the books that they chose, they eliminated books that sort of gave any inclination towards a Messiah or any messianic texts. And so that was sort of the lens that they were looking at, because they wanted to be able to go back to this Christian uprising and say, there's no evidence of these things in our text. And so they removed 7 books. But I think it's also important to note that there were also like Ethiopian Jews that weren't even a part of that discussion. And they kept those 7 books in their version of the Old Testament. When it comes to what Christian Bible we should use, that the Jews forming that for us doesn't hold any weight. They aren't part of that apostolic succession that we have when it came to how the books were chosen. So that's the first thing I just wanted to get out of the way, is that these books have been around forever. They were there from the beginning. They were even debated in 90 AD. So there's not this addition of them later on. It was more of a removal of them at a certain point when it started to conflict with their worldview and how they perceived it going. The early Christians, they used a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. And they used that to go around and evangelize and to let people know about Jesus and the coming of Jesus. And in this Septuagint, there were all of the books. There were all, the normal Old Testament, the Old Testament that the Protestants would recognize, but there were also the 7 books that the Catholics recognize. And when they went around evangelizing, there was never a point when they said, now everything in the Septuagint is great, but make sure you ignore these 7 books. We don't put as much weight into these 7 books. It was never documented that way. In the same vein, with the Septuagint and all these things going on, it's important to note as well that prior Protestant historians agreed that these books existed back in the Old Testament, at the beginning of the church. There is a Protestant historian, J.N.D. Kelly, and he wrote that it should be observed that the Old Testament, thus admitted as authoritative in the Church, was somewhat bulkier and more comprehensive than the Protestant Bible. It always included, though with varying degrees of recognition, the so-called Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. So that is a Protestant historian that said, if you were to just go back into the history of the Church, we acknowledge that these books were a part of it at the time. And then you'll also notice, I don't know if we addressed it, but he did use the word Apocrypha. As Catholics, we would not use that word because it has the implication of the false books. And so we don't believe that they are false, and so we say Deuterocanonical, so it's sort of like the second canon. And so I just think that that's really interesting. And then the last points I want to talk about would be how the early church fathers and the councils that were set up viewed the Deuterocanonical books. And so when you go back and you look at 382 AD, there was the Council of Rome, and after that council, Pope Damasus I wrote that In his words, "It is likewise decreed, now indeed we must treat of the divine scriptures, what the universal church accepts and what she must shun." And then he goes on to list the books that must be accepted, and in there are the Deuterocanonical books. And so that's in 382 AD. And I really think the important thing to remember about councils in the Catholic faith was that they were never put together to come up with new doctrine. They were never coming to the people and saying, "Hey, we've decided that there are new things we want you all to start believing." What happened was the church was practicing these things forever. They were reading the Deuterocanonical books, and all of a sudden you start having uprisings in different areas of people saying, "This doesn't really match up with what I believe, and so I'm going to remove them, or I'm going to study this, or I'm going to read this." And the church has to come in and say, that's not your place. And it's a very humbling experience to have to admit that there's a greater authority than your own when it comes to what is in the faith and what is not. And so this council came together just to reaffirm what they had already been doing for the last 350 years. And so it's not a coming out with new information, but just reaffirming that we're supposed to practice it a certain way, and if you are not, you are technically not practicing the Catholic faith, which is the universal faith. The last thing I want to talk about is just how the early church fathers viewed it, because I know there's a lot of people that will say that that the Deuterocanonical books were not often praised or even acknowledged as being doctrine by some of the early church fathers. I think the answer to that is well, yeah, I think that's kind of obvious. I think that even today we have instances of people that veer off of the path. No one is saying that these humans are perfectly capable of understanding what is supposed to be in there and what is not. But most of the examples that they give, if you were to go back to those early church fathers in later writings, oftentimes they are sort of going back on what they originally said, and they've come around to the idea of the Deuterocanonical books being in there. And even if there were 3, 4, 5 that questioned them, I do think questioning your faith is a good thing. There are also, tens and of others that are counteracting that and saying, no, this is the way it's supposed to be. And so I think it's important to realize that the minority were saying that they had issues with it, and then the church came in and stepped in and said, "Well, I understand that you have issues with this, but this is the way that it is supposed to be. We don't have the luxury of choosing what we want to believe." And so that's a very difficult thing to come to grasp with, is that you have to take a step back and realize that I have to practice the hard things too, and not just the easy things. And then the only other thing I'd like to add is just oftentimes it is viewed, at least when we're discussing it, that some of the books that were removed are also really the best example of Catholic doctrine. Like in Second Maccabees, you have the people praying for the souls of people that have passed away, which is a great way of indicating that there's this place of purgatory where people are not in heaven yet and not in hell, or else why would you pray? And so it's just interesting that a lot of the things that make the most obvious points to Catholic doctrine were removed from the Bible with the removal of the Deuterocanonical books. And so you sort of have to ask yourself, why is that? Why would someone do that? And it begins to look like we are trying to take the church into our own hands, and it's no longer the gospel according to John, but it's the gospel according to, insert name here. And that's something that we should all try to avoid. So I will say that I'd like to try and end, I don't always remember, but I try to end these things with a challenge to you, and I really challenge you to find one of the 7 Deuterocanonical books and just read it from start to finish, and try and understand whether you are looking at it as a canon book or just as a historical text, that you can still gain knowledge about Jesus' church that he established by reading these books. But with that, this is where I'd like to end, and so I would like to thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Thanks.